the United Arab Emirates.
The UAE, yeah.
A country many knew for being, pretty neutral, focused inward. But lately, they've become this incredibly assertive, sometimes even aggressive, force around the Red Sea.
It's been a dramatic shift.
So our mission today is to unpack what's driving them. What are their aims? We're talking economic goals, sure, but also some powerful ideological drivers. And crucially, how are their actions reshaping the whole region, especially using tactics that some observers are calling, frankly, divide and rule?
That's right. And for this, we're looking at quite a range of analyses, investigative reports too, that really try to peel back the layers on the UAE strategy.
So not just what they say they're doing.
No, exactly. Trying to get at the stated goals, but also the unstated motives, the deeper stuff. The idea is to help you understand not just what the UAE is up to in the Red Sea, but really why it matters. Because these actions, they're shifting alliances, they're impacting security, and they have real humanitarian consequences across, a vital global pathway.
Okay, let's start with that big shift you mentioned. For years, the UAE had this image, right? Stable, neutral, maybe a bit quiet on the foreign policy front.
Yeah.
But our sources show this pivot, really kicking off around the mid-2010s. What sparked that? What's the big picture ambition here?
Well, the transition is really quite something, moving from that perceived neutrality at this very assertive interventionist stance, largely under the leadership of Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, MBZ.
Right.
It looks like a deliberate fusion, combining big economic ambitions with direct military action, often acting alone. The analyses we've looked at suggest that Gulf monarchies, the UAE included, increasingly see the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea coast as a kind of strategic perimeter.
A perimeter, meaning what exactly?
Meaning a buffer zone, essentially. A region they need to influence to minimize political threats closer to home. They're particularly wary of, say, Islamist movements gaining ground or even democratic uprisings, things they worry could inspire similar movements within the Gulf itself.
Ah, okay. So it's defensive in a way, but projected outwards.
Precisely. And this translates into a very hands-on strategy in the Red Sea. It weaves together economic moves, huge port investments, logistics deals, resource extraction with military presence, setting up bases, funding, and training local proxy forces.
And that's where those strong descriptions come in.
Yeah, some sources call it an autonomous expansionist project. Others even use the term sub-imperialism. The idea is that they're building a kind of mini empire based on controlling ports and using these proxy forces. And often they're doing it without necessarily waiting for a green light from, say, the US or other traditional partners.
Sub-imperialism. That's a heavy term. It implies a very deliberate strategy. So as they build this mini empire, what are the core drivers? The sources seem to point to four main pillars consistently.
That's a good way to put it. 4 pillars.
Let's start with the economic angle. Seems like controlling trade routes, those critical choke points, is paramount.
Absolutely. That's foundational. Getting a grip on key ports and sea lanes is central to their policy. And their state-owned giant, DP World, is the main tool here.
The port operator.
Exactly. They've been incredibly active, acquiring stakes or management deals in ports all over the region. Think Aden and Mukalla in Yemen, Berbera over in Somaliland, Bosaso in Puntland.
So creating a network.
Precisely. The reports describe it as aiming for a literal string of ports all along that Red Sea Gulf of Aden corridor. The goal, to secure influence, if not outright control, over choke points like Bab al-Mandab.
The strait connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Hugely important.
Massively important. A huge chunk of global oil and goods passes right through there. It's a critical artery, and they want a hand on the tap, so to speak.
And Port Sudan fits into this.
Perfectly. The UAE has wanted access there for a long time. They see it as a gateway to African markets. Emirati companies kept making offers, proposing big money to privatize and develop the port.
But they face pushback.
Fierce pushback. Sudanese port unions, nationalist groups, they were very vocal, called it neo-colonial encroachment. They didn't want foreign control.
But there's more to Sudan for the UAE than just the port, isn't there? Something quieter.
Oh, absolutely. Gold. Sudan's gold is a huge, quiet prize. Estimates suggest something like 80, maybe even 90% of Sudan's gold exports, both the legal stuff and the smuggled stuff, end up flowing to the UAE.
Wow, 80 to 90%.
Yeah. It makes Abu Dhabi a massive financial beneficiary. And it gives them a very deep vested interest in who holds power in Sudan, especially power that facilitates that trade. It lets them shape things from behind the scenes.
Okay, so there's the powerful economic engine.
Yeah.
But beyond commerce, there's the military footprint you mentioned.
Yeah.
Where are they actually setting up shop, militarily speaking, and why does a relatively small country need this kind of projection?
Well, they've built this network of what sources call flexible outposts or military installations. It started quite visibly in Eritrea around 2015. They leased the port of Assab for 30 years.
Assad, right, that was key for their Yemen operation.
Exactly, it was the launch pad.
Hmm.
Then in Yemen itself, their footprint just ballooned after 2015. They took control of Aden, the key southern port, and also strategic islands like Perim, right in the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and Socotra, further out.
So Cotra's positioning seems crucial.
It is. Sitting there at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, controlling islands like that gives them, effectively, command and surveillance over all the shipping passing through. It's prime real estate for maritime control.
And they've looked elsewhere, too.
Plans were floated for facilities in Berbera, Somaliland, we'll come back to that. And they have ongoing operations in Bosaso, Puntland. The key thing to understand is how they often establish these positions.
Which is?
Often by backing local armed groups or supporting breakaway regional authorities. It allows them to build influence, gain access, maybe even achieve control on the ground, but without always having UAE boots directly planted everywhere. It keeps things deniable.
Plausible deniability. So it's agile, opportunistic, maybe?
Very much so. It allows them to project power quite effectively for their size.
Okay, so economic control, military positioning. But it feels like there's something else driving this, something deeper. The sources really point to a strong ideological current. This isn't just about money or bases, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. That's a critical piece. A major, though often less explicitly stated, goal is to actively push back against the rise of Islamist movements, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, and also broader democratic movements.
Why? What's the threat perception there?
They see these movements as fundamental threats to their own system, that monarchical system in the UAE, and to the kind of regional order they prefer, which is stable, predictable, and authoritarian-led. So they're pushing what our sources call a counter-revolutionary, authoritarian-friendly agenda.
Can you give examples of that in action?
Sure. Look at Yemen again. Fighting the Houthis was one thing, yes. But the UAE also made very specific efforts to sideline the Isla Party.
Which is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Exactly. And instead, they actively empowered militias that were secular or sometimes hardline Salafi, but crucially, not Islamist in the Brotherhood mold. It was about reshaping the post-conflict political landscape.
And Sudan seems like an even clearer case.
Extremely clear. The UAE, along with the Saudis, openly celebrated the 2019 military coup that threw out Omar al-Bashir, who had Islamist leanings. They immediately pledged $3 billion in support.
And their preferred partners there.
Generals like Burhan, the army chief, and especially Mohammed Hamid Dagalo, the head of the RSF.
Hemeti again. The militia leader implicated in the Port Sudan strikes.
The very same. Why back him? Because he's seen as promising a secular authoritarian order. He's anti-Islamist, he's business-focused, and presumably pliable to Emirati economic interests, like that gold trade we talked about.
So it creates this kind of axis.
Yeah, an anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-democracy axis is how some analysts frame it. And it stretches across the region, strengthened by partnerships with other authoritarian leaders, like Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki. It's very much an ideological contest playing out.
Which brings us to maybe the most surprising piece of this puzzle, the growing partnership with Israel. Especially in the Red Sea. That feels like a major shift from historical dynamics. What's driving that convergence?
It is a huge shift. And the Abraham Accords in 2020 really just brought it out into the open. Before that, there were quieter links, but this made it formal, pragmatic.
What are the shared interests pushing them together there?
They see eye to eye on several major perceived threats. Iran, obviously, is a big one for both, but also Islamist movements, Hamas for Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood for the UAE, and they both view the regional activism of Turkey and Qatar, who often backed those Islamist groups, as a challenge.
So common enemies, common goals in the Red Sea.
Fundamentally, yes. Both want the Red Sea secured as a safe shipping lane and as a kind of strategic buffer zone against these shared threats.
And how is this playing out practically?
We're seeing a rapid expansion in intelligence sharing, defense technology cooperation. A really potent example is Socotra Island, which is now firmly under UAE control. Multiple credible reports suggest the UAE and Israel are setting up or have set up a joint intelligence base there.
A joint base on Socotra. What would that do?
It would allow them to pool resources. Israel has the high-tech surveillance capabilities. The UAE has the physical control on the ground. Together, they can conduct really extensive monitoring of all the maritime traffic moving through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. It significantly boosts their shared situational awareness.
And does the UAE's control of ports offer Israel other advantages?
Potentially, yes. Indirect access. Having influence or control over ports like Port Sudan or Assab in Eritrea could give Israel access to Red Sea infrastructure that historically would have been completely off limits politically.
Are there signs this is actually happening?
Well, there are indications of coordinated action. For example, reports surface that Israel and the UAE worked together behind the scenes to kill a deal that would have given Russia a naval base at Port Sudan, presumably because they saw its strategic value for their own alignment.
Interesting. They didn't want Russia there, maybe wanted it for themselves, or at least friendly access.
That seems to be the implication. And there's also been some speculation coming out of Ethiopia and even Israeli sources about possible Israeli naval visits to Berbera in Somaliland, perhaps under the UAE's umbrella there. It points to this quiet, deepening strategic cooperation.
And this all ties back to pushing against Turkey and Qatar.
Yes, it's part of a joint geopolitical alignment against those powers, who they saw as backing Islamist-friendly governments. There are even reports of Israel supporting UAE outreach to specific regional leaders, say in Somalia, by sharing intelligence on Islamist networks to bolster their mutual goals. It's a really complex web.
A very complex web indeed. Okay, so we have these four pillars: economic extraction, military projection, the anti-Islamist authoritarian ideology, and the Israeli nexus. Let's shift now to the tactics. How do these big aims translate on the ground? The sources consistently mention this divide and rule approach, especially in places like Somalia.
Yes, Somalia is almost a case study in this tactic.
Yeah.
The UAE has been very adept, you could say, at exploiting Somalia's existing internal divisions, the fragile central government versus powerful autonomous regions, historical clan rivalries to gain influence.
How specifically?
Take Somaliland. It declared independence decades ago, functions autonomously, but isn't internationally recognized. Most countries still see it as part of Somalia. The UAE, however, struck direct deals with the Somaliland authorities,
Bypassing Mogadishu, the federal capital.
completely bypassing Mogadishu. The big one was the deal for DP World to develop Berbera Port, a huge investment, $442 million. They even had plans for a military base there initially.
And how did Mogadishu react?
Predictably, with outrage. They saw it as a blatant violation of Somali sovereignty, a direct attempt to undermine national unity by dealing with a breakaway region as if it were independent. They accused the UAE point-blank of exploiting and deepening internal divisions.
Did it escalate beyond words?
Oh, yes. Tensions got so bad that in 2018, Somalia actually expelled Emirati military trainers who were operating in Mogadishu and even seized large shipments of cash arriving from the UAE, suspecting it was meant to influence Somali politics. It was a major diplomatic fallout.
And we see a similar pattern in Puntland, another autonomous region.
Very similar playbook. In Puntland, the UAE trained and equipped the Puntland Maritime Police Force ostensibly for counter-piracy, but it also bolstered the regional authorities' security forces relative to the federal government. DP World also took over operations at the port of Bosaso there, again, backing local factions, often in defiance of Mogadishu.
And there was that recent controversy with the radar system in Bosaso.
That's right. The UAE installed an advanced radar system, which reports suggest is Israeli-made, at Bosaso Airport. The stated reason was partly to counter Houthi drone threats from Yemen across the Gulf of Aden.
But there were other concerns.
Yes, significant concerns that this facility, with its location and capabilities, could also be used to facilitate covert arms shipments. Specifically, weapons potentially going to the RSF in Sudan, flowing through Puntland. It connects back to their involvement in that conflict, potentially using one proxy base to supply another.
So this tactic, dealing directly with regions or factions, undermining the central authority. It's not just Somalia.
No, the pattern repeats. Look at Yemen. The UAE didn't just fight the Houthis. It actively cultivated and funded a whole array of southern militias, most prominently the Southern Transitional Council, the STC.
Who want independence for South Yemen.
Exactly. The STC, backed by the UAE, seized control of Aden and other key southern areas, effectively carving out an autonomous zone heavily influenced by Abu Dhabi. This massively complicated efforts to unify Yemen, its divide and rule in action.
And Sudan. with Hemeti and the RSF.
It fits the pattern again, aligning with the RSF, a powerful, regionally based militia with its own economic interests and a strong anti-Islamist stance against the established, albeit fragmented, central state and army. It shows a clear preference for dealing with pliable strongmen or factions, even if it fuels conflict.
Even amidst those extremely serious accusations of enabling genocide by arming the RSF, with an actual case, now the ICJ.
Even then, the strategic alignment seems to override those concerns, at least publicly. It highlights the very high stakes and the potential human cost of this approach.
Okay, so this strategy, assertive, interventionist, using divide and rule, has clearly given the UAE a lot of clout, made them a major player. But it must come with risks, right? This can't be a cost-free approach.
Oh, absolutely not. The risks are substantial and multi-layered. First off, there's the risk of backlash from the very populations or nationalist forces they're dealing with.
Like the port workers in Sudan.
Exactly. Or the nationalist reaction in Somalia that got the Berbera-based deal canceled and the trainers kicked out. Local resentment can build up and directly thwart their plans. You can't just impose your will indefinitely without consequences.
What about relying so heavily on proxies like the RSF or the STC?
That's another huge risk. Proxy dependence. What happens when your proxy goes rogue or pursues its own agenda or simply fails spectacularly? The RSF in Sudan is the nightmare scenario, really. The UAE poured resources into Hemeti, and now Sudan is in flames. And UAE finds itself facing accusations of complicity in atrocities at the World Court. That's serious blowback.
And direct attacks, too.
Yes, the Houthi missile and drone strikes hitting Abu Dhabi itself back in 2022 were a direct consequence of the UAE's deep involvement in the Yemen war. And al-Shabaab has targeted Emirati personnel in Somalia. Getting deeply involved in these conflicts inevitably exposes the UAE homeland to retaliation. The security risks become very real.
What about relations with traditional allies like the U.S.?
That's another area of friction. There's growing unease, particularly in the U.S. Congress, about the UAE's role in places like Sudan and Libya. Calls to restrict arms sales have gotten louder. Remember, the UAE briefly paused talks on buying F-35 jets. That was partly seen as pushback against U.S. conditions, asserting autonomy, but it also reflected this growing scrutiny. Maintaining that Western support while pursuing such an independent, sometimes destabilizing regional policy is a tricky balancing act.
And if the UAE stumbles, others are waiting to step in.
Always. Regional rivals like Turkey and Qatar are constantly looking for opportunities. Turkey had projects in Sudan before, and its influence in Somalia grew when UAE relations soured. Don't forget other players, China with its economic interests, Russia looking for footholds, even Iran. Any setback for the UAE creates a vacuum that these other powers are eager to fill. The Red Sea is a crowded geopolitical space.
Finally, can a small country actually sustain this level of engagement?
That's the big question of overextension. We're talking about a nation with fewer than 10 million people, only about 1 million actual citizens, running multiple overseas bases, managing complex proxy relationships, being involved in simultaneous conflicts across Yemen, the Horn of Africa, potentially Libya. It puts a massive strain on financial resources, yes, but also on human capital, diplomatic bandwidth. Is this model sustainable in the long run? That's a real concern highlighted in the analyses.
So considering all these risks, the local pushback, the proxy problems, the potential loss of Western goodwill, rivals moving in, and just the sheer strain of it all, what's the bottom line here? The UAE has, without a doubt, changed the game in the Red Sea. They're a force to be reckoned with now.
Undeniably, they've become a pivotal actor very quickly.
And it paints this really complex, kind of fascinating picture, doesn't it? A nation using its money, its military reach, and this strong ideological stance to reshape its neighborhood, often acting quite boldly, even unilaterally. But the sources we've looked at keep coming back to this core tension. Can you really try to remake a region as volatile as the Red Sea according to your own interests, especially using tactics like divide and rule and backing controversial factions without ultimately just fanning the flames of the very instability you claim you want to prevent?
That is the fundamental question, isn't it? And it leads to a final thought, perhaps, for you listening to consider. As the UAE keeps walking this tightrope, balancing its own ambitions with its reliance, however strained, on allies, and facing these growing risks and local resistance, how long-lasting will this mini-empire prove to be? What does its rise and its methods truly mean for the future of trade, security, and the balance of power along one of the most critical maritime crossroads on the planet?
Definitely a lot to think about there. Thanks for walking us through this deep dive. Really crucial context for understanding that region today.